How's it going? So I am so excited to be here today with the Dr. Milton Mills. He was also featured in the hit documentary What the Health, which is a documentary that talks about the health implications of veganism, and it's available on Netflix. Do you want to kind of briefly go over what got you interested in this type of work?
Sure.
And a little bit of your background?
Sure. A bridge version of the story is that when I was 14, I joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church encourages members to become plant-based. It doesn't require it, but it does encourage us to become plant-based because that is what the Bible says God's original diet for us was, to be vegan.
Yeah.
And even though I understood that, and it's definitely right there in the Bible, I still struggled with giving up eating meat because I thought I could live without it.
Yeah.
But about I would say maybe a year to a year and a half after I joined the church, I was struggling with some personal issues, and I was talking with God about it one day, about these problems I was having, and basically he said to me, if you want a closer relationship with me, you have to have a clearer mind, and for that you need a better diet. You have to stop eating meat. And so I said, well, if that's what you want, take away the desire to eat it, and he did, and that's when I went plant-based.
Wow, that's a really unique and rare, transition to plant-based veganism. I feel like most of the time people use religion to justify eating meat.
No, right, and no, it's very clear from reading what the Bible says is that God created the animals on this planet to be our companions, not to be abused and mistreated and consumed. My original reason for changing was spiritual and health.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that did was, once I stopped eating animals, it freed me up to see the ethical side of the argument. I was horrified at seeing the animals killed.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a bull or a cow, but I'm telling you, the animal looked at me with a look that said, help me, do something. And I remember standing there looking at that animal and feeling utterly helpless, and it hurt.
Yep.
Because I was watching, I knew what was going to happen. The animal knew what was going to happen, and I couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
When I started college, I decided that I was going to get a degree in health sciences and then a master's in public health and try to educate people about diet change. But as I was going through that process, I realized that if I only had a master's in public health, people would always tell me, you can't tell me what to eat because you're not a doctor. And so I realized that in order to really help people understand why it was important to change their diet to preserve their health, I needed to be a physician. When I was doing my pre-med recs, one of my very good friends, his dad died from a massive heart attack, and he was only 52 years old.
Yeah, it's young.
And he was a great guy. I just remember, when I was at his family's house, seeing first of all, I like Mr. Richardson a lot, and I felt the pain, but I remember distinctly looking at his family and seeing the devastation that they felt, and I really wanted to try and help prevent this from happening to other people.
Yeah. And
so that's what, really confirmed me on this pathway to really try and help people understand that, if we change our diets, if we eat and live differently, then we don't have to suffer, these heart attacks and cancers and diabetes and all of the other problems that are associated with the Western style diet.
And so at this point, when you were making these connections, did you already kind of were you already, like, because, you know, a lot of your work, you talk about the racial implications of veganism, and at this point, did you already kind of know about that connection between things? Or?
No, and that's really interesting. And so the question is, where did that come from? So, when I finished residency, I was working in outpatient clinic setting, and I was actually doing urgent care for Kaiser. I would have patients coming in, and African American patients telling me, "Oh, doc, my irritable bowel is acting up, or my spastic colon is bothering me," and I would do a careful history, and these were people who were continuing to eat dairy products, and I felt pretty confident that the problem was not that they had a spastic colon or irritable bowel, but that they were eating food that they should be eating. So I would have these patients do a 2-week trial of no dairy, come back and see me, and we'd see if the problem had cleared up. And in at least 8 to 9 out of 10 cases, the problem had disappeared.
Yeah.
And so I explained to the patient that you don't have irritable bowel or spastic colon, you're lactose intolerant. Or some people like to say lactose normal,
right.
since the majority of people really don't tolerate lactose.
Yeah, none of us should be eating it.
But the watershed moment came when I had an elderly black woman who, you know, we went through the whole thing. She did the 2 weeks. She came back. The problems had cleared up, and I said to her, I said, "Well, you know, you're lactose intolerant," and she said, "Oh, I know that." And I was stunned, because I said to her, "Well, if you know that you can't tolerate this stuff, why are you eating it?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Because the government says I have to. The dietary guideline says that I'm supposed to get, you know, however many servings of dairy foods every day to keep myself healthy." And at that point, I became really angry, because I knew that for a fact that the government understood that the majority of people of color in the United States do not tolerate dairy foods. Furthermore, African American women are genetically protected against getting osteoporosis in the first place. Well, and let me say parenthetically, dairy foods don't protect against osteoporosis. Dairy foods do not make stronger bones. Dairy foods have never been shown to protect bone health.
Yeah.
But that's why we're told we should eat them. It's because supposedly they're good for our bones. Well, African American women don't even have the problem that these foods are supposedly supposed to help us with. And I realized at that point that the government was encouraging people of color to eat foods that it knew would make them ill, just so that people in the dairy industry and other forms of agribusiness can make money.
Yeah. And
that, by definition, is institutional racism. You are basically pimping one population for the benefit of another. I approached PCRM, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and said, you know, we need to do a paper on this. And Neil Barnard, who's the director, agreed, and we did a 2-part paper called Racial Bias in the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, parts 1 and 2, that were published in the National Medical Association's journal in 1999.
Wow, that's actually...
It's
fairly
been a while.
long ago.
Yeah.
I'm surprised then that even... It's like things that had already been known at that time.
Oh, and by that point, this had been knowledge for over like 60 years. The government has known since the early part of the 20th century that the majority of people of color do not tolerate dairy foods. When it comes to dealing with communities of color, the U.S. government has a kind of a typical pattern, meaning it will take minority populations from a situation where they have food security and they're able to basically be self-sufficient, put them in a place where they are food insecure and where they become reliant upon the government for food subsidies, or in essence. But then the government gives them the kinds of foods that create chronic diseases. So one of the classic cases is what was done to the Native Americans. In the United States, most Native American tribes were agrarian-based communities that grew their own foods, had a plant-based diet that, they supplemented with some animal foods, but they were largely plant-based. And in fact, sort of the classic dynamic is the three sisters, what's referred to as the three sisters, which are beans, corn, and squash that were grown by native peoples. And what the government did was, and this is really interesting, when they decided that they wanted more land so that they could expand cotton and tobacco planting so that, again, people could make money off these cash crops, they literally forced these native nations to leave their ancestral homeland and purposely displace them to marginal reservations where they couldn't grow their own crops, where they couldn't be food sufficient or food secure, and they were therefore completely dependent on the government for their food subsidies. And then what did the government do? It started giving them things like white flour, sugar, alcohol, canned meat, all of the things that we know create chronic disease. So again, this was an institutionalized racist dynamic. And with African Americans, we were basically dragged out of West Africa, again, where West Africans typically had
I'm sorry, there's like a huge glare.
Yeah, and this dynamic of taking people from a place where they're food secure, where they're able to be self-sufficient with raising their own crops, and putting them in a place where they can't take care of themselves, where
created dependence.
Right, exactly. And then they turn around and use them so that people in agribusiness can make money off of them by selling them these commodity foods. And these commodity foods are specifically chosen because they are things that can be warehoused. So, in other words, you can take whole wheat flour. Once you process it into white flour, it has a shelf life of 1,000,000 years.
Right.
Once you process grains into oils, again, shelf life that goes on forever. You take canned meat, which is, meat itself is unhealthy, but then when you process it and can it, it becomes even more unhealthy. Again, it becomes, it has this very long shelf life. And then they basically use these minority populations as dumping grounds for this stuff that they sell to the government, which is then dumped in these communities. People make money, but the ethnic minority populations pay the price in ill health.
Yeah, I remember that scene in What the Health where they went through that town in North Carolina, and they talk about how that one pig farm was literally spraying fecal matter into the air because there was so much they didn't know what else to do with it.
It's vile.
It's disgusting, and the people there were so sick with asthma, cancers, and just
exactly.
And that's not, and obviously that's not an isolated situation. Right. It happens.
No, it happens over and over. And even this, right now in this country, we're talking about immigration and immigration policy, and once again, the argument has been framed in a way that makes it look like the ethnic minorities, the Hispanics, are the villains. But the fact is that we're living on stolen land that was stolen from Mexico.
Yes, exactly.
And where these people were just, displaced. But even more importantly, the fact of the matter is that the reason we have undocumented immigrants is because big business wants undocumented immigrants. They use them to suppress wages. Everybody knows damn well that if migrant workers weren't in the fields picking fruits and vegetables, we wouldn't have anything in the supermarkets. These people are brought into this country specifically for that purpose. but they are not allowed to become citizens, and they are forced to remain in this undocumented status. Why? Because it means that
they can get underpaid.
They can be underpaid.
Yeah.
They are, again, food and economically insecure, so they are much easier to control. And again, because they can be paid such low wages, it allows big business to suppress wages. Because if the owners of these farms, if the owners of these meat packing plants had to pay a fair wage, their profit margin would plummet. I mean, they would still make money, but the greedy they're so greedy that they don't want to be fair, and they don't want to pay a fair wage. And so, again, this is just part of a well-established pattern in this country.
And and that's the thing, it's nothing new. Like, it reminds me of those stories within times of slavery, how they would, like, you know, like they would give the slaves the pig's hooves and everything. Like they would just give them the worst of the worst, the garbage.
Right.
And it's foolish to assume that just because slavery ended, it means that now everyone's treated equal. Like, that doesn't mean anything. Like, it's happening just on another in another.
It's just changed its form. Exactly.
It's changed its form. Exactly.
Right. When I talk to African American groups, I really despise this idea of so-called soul food, because this isn't soul food. African Americans were dragged over here from West Africa and literally force-fed the garbage, actual garbage of the plantations where they were enslaved. That's why they ended up with the hooves and the neck bones and the tail bones and the ears and the entrail. You know, God bless them for doing their best to take that garbage and turn it into some kind of cuisine.
Yeah.
But the problem is that once we were released from slavery, instead of leaving that garbage on the plantation, we owned it and took it with us and christened it soul food, and it's not soul food, it's plantation food. And the thing that I like to point people back to is what traditional West African diets were and are. They are traditionally plant-based diets that are low in fat, built around whole, intact plant foods. They have no dairy and very little meat. And that's a much healthier way to eat.
Yeah.
And that's our true heritage, not this garbage that we were forced to eat when we were enslaved.
I'm from Chicago, and people talk about the Chicago violence that goes on, and, like, you know, all this gang stuff, and like how it's all concentrated to you know, like the black communities and everything. But if you look at what these communities are eating and what they're fed, like, your food affects your mentality.
Oh, it absolutely does.
It affects the weight, like it affects your psyche.
Yeah, that keeps them in these high stress situations where they're fed, as you say, diets that actually promote depression and anxiety and mood and behavior disorders.
Yeah.
And this works itself out in, you know, the kinds of things we see occurring in these inner city areas.
Yeah.
And the converse to that is that people have taken so-called troubled teenagers and put them in a situation where they've been placed on plant-based diets, and the behavioral issues that these kids have, they plummet.
Yeah.
They become much more cooperative, much less prone to outbursts and antisocial behaviors, and so the food has a huge impact on that.
Absolutely.
People need to get back to a plant-based diet. It is the diet that God says He designed us to eat. Medical science shows that it's the healthiest diet for us. We know that it has a much more favorable impact on our mood and our behavior, and it will help correct diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, asthma, stroke. I mean, across the board.
Yeah.
A plant-based diet helps reverse or prevent all of these things.
And you've also mentioned before in your lectures that we are actually herbivores.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Human beings are, when you do look at the comparative anatomy, you look at carnivores, herbivores, and even by design omnivores like bears and raccoons, it's crystal clear that human beings are strict herbivores. We are not omnivores, and we are definitely not carnivores. And we should be eating a strictly plant-based diet.
Yeah.
And for people who want more information on that, you can go to YouTube and type in Dr. Milton Mills, and a lecture will come up called Are Humans Designed to Eat Meat?, which will explain in great detail why we are strict herbivores.
That's awesome. I really, really appreciate your time.
Alana, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much. I highly recommend that you watch What the Health if you haven't already. It's an incredibly well-made and powerful documentary. And yeah, I also just encourage you guys to do your own research.
Absolutely.
To experiment with your own bodies and just see for yourself. Just before you make any conclusion, try it out and see how you feel, see how you react to it, and before you go and judge other people for their behavior and what they're doing, look at what the circumstances are around them and have compassion for the choices that certain communities are presented with having to make due to what they've been, what circumstances have been brought upon them.
Historically, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
All right.
Have a great one.